The Second World War lasted for 6 years, and while Nazi Germany proved to be a domineering force and had the upper hand in the earlier battles during the war, the Allied forces were soon able to match the military prowess of the Germans and emerge the victors. Although it became apparent that Hitler and his forces had no chance of winning the war since 1944, the German military would not officially surrender until 1945. Hey there, and welcome to your favorite history and war channel, where we bring you detailed facts about the greatest wars ever fought in human history. Today's special video will literally blow your mind, as we've thoroughly detailed just why Nazi Germany refused to cower and surrender even in the face of imminent defeat. But before we dive right in, make sure to give this video a like, hit the subscribe button, and smash that notification bell. Do leave us a comment as well, as we'd love to read your opinions on Hitler and Germany's role during the Second World War. Germany's military forces had become so outstretched and badly decimated by 1944 that the Allied forces were now able to push Nazi troops back and destroy many German cities using constant aerial attacks. The spate of the attacks on German strongholds was relentless. Germany's approach to the war from the very onset had been to fight to the death, and all Nazi soldiers had been instilled with this ideology. Surrendering was completely out of the option, and as such, even when Nazi troops suffered more casualties than they previously did in the last 10 months of the war, surrendering was still not on the table. To the generals and commanders of the Nazi army, it was more dignifying to fight to the point of self-annihilation than surrender. But aside from the self-destruct ideology of Hitler and his army that prevented an early surrender as was hoped by the Allied forces, there were other major reasons as well. Foremost was the widespread fear of Hitler and his totalitarian rule by the commanders and soldiers in the Nazi troops. From February 1945, the harsh treatment that had been applied to Nazi adversaries was now being applied internally to an increasing number of German citizens who had now begun to withdraw their support for the war and were pushing for a surrender. These civilians were convinced that the war had been lost and Germany needed to urgently surrender to avert more casualties and destruction. Many German soldiers also began to feel the same way, and a few who were able to seize the opportunity to desert the Nazi army quickly did. Those caught while attempting to desert paid the very heavy price of having their lives snuffed out by rains of bullets from a firing squad. The early months of 1945 especially, flying marshal councils roamed across the country to arrest, try, and execute suspected deserters in the German army. A certain General Schomer, who was one of Hitler's close confidants and a Nazi loyalist, became one of the most resolute hardliners that supported and encouraged the execution. As the number of executed German soldiers grew due to attempts to desert, a lot of the Nazi troops were forced to continue fighting and die fighting enemy forces than being summarily executed. This was even while many knew it'd be impossible for Germany to win the war and defeat became more inevitable. With a lot of the more experienced Nazi officers already lost to the war or summarily executed, an increasing number of inexperienced officers were appointed to command Nazi troops. These lower and middle-ranked officers were often men who'd been specially groomed to serve in Hitler's youth squad all through the late 1930s. They had been thoroughly indoctrinated with Nazi ideologies and were proven hardliners who would stand and fight till the last man. Hitler's failed assassination attempt has also been identified as another core reason for the refusal to surrender by the Nazi army. Despite the odds of the war fast turning against Germany, Hitler still had many hardcore loyalists in the army. The attempt on Hitler in July 1944 was quickly followed by a coup attempt in Berlin. The operation was termed Operation Valkyrie, and its objective was to eliminate Hitler and seize control of the country. The failed assassination and coup attempt had severe repercussions and consequences for soldiers in both higher and lower ranks of the Nazi army. With all the coup conspirators completely executed, many of whom were high-ranking Nazi officials, Hitler would go on to replace every general who had previously expressed doubts about the war effort with more of his younger and resolute Nazi-indoctrinated soldiers. This move saw the renewed radicalization of both the military and civilian population within Germany. Every German was radicalized into accepting the concept of a total war, which meant soldiers had to hold their ground until death, and surrendering to the enemy was considered cowardly and a betrayal. This only prolonged the inevitable defeat and the suffering of many German soldiers at the war front. Civilians and forced laborers were called upon to work on fortifications. In eastern Prussia, over 100,000 people were put to work to create the Eastern Wall, but these only proved futile eventually. This tactic of fortification already proved futile in Russia, when the Red Army moved around the German stronghold and dealt major destruction to the German army. The German city was heavily bombarded with air raids in 1944 and was besieged by the Soviets in January 1945. The city fell to ruin when the Soviets launched their final assault in April 1945. The Soviets annexed the city and renamed it Kaliningrad, which is still today a Russian city. The war dragged on and the Germans took their heaviest toll. It was reported that between July 1944 and May 1945, more German civilians died than in the years before. Many civilians died in the aerial raids as most Allied bombs were dropped after July 1944. The Soviets also invaded eastern territories, which led to even more casualties for the Germans. It's estimated that over 5.3 million men of the 18.2 million German military personnel died during the war, with more than half of this number being killed during the last 10 months of the war. Hitler was also especially a stubborn dictator. The Führer was determined to avoid a scenario where he had to surrender to the Allied forces at all cost, and preferred a heroic defeat over a cowardly early capitulation. He cared less about prolonging the war or causing more human suffering for his soldiers. His rigidity excluded all other options or opinions, and it was all or nothing for Hitler. This was elaborated by the fact that he was the supreme commander of all armed forces, and those directly below him wouldn't dare to break with him. His subordinates were bound to his rule, and other Nazi elites lacked the will to prevent him. It was only after Hitler committed suicide that Germany declared their unconditional surrender to the Allied forces on May 7, 1945, at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force at Reims in northeastern France.